I just think it's extremely difficult. It's not a reflection on Thibs. It's not that I think he's like a bad person or he's not, a smart basketball person. I understand a ton of what Thibs supporters appreciate about him. Hard work, consistency, dedication, longevity, adherence to core values and core principles. All that stuff really matters. It matters in the game and it matters for life. And so I totally understand the appreciation of Thibs from that standpoint. At the same time, we're talking about practical on-court stuff. In my opinion, there are smarter, younger, better coaches who have maybe learned from a lot of what he's done in the past, and he's been able to kind of help them build to where they are now. But now this is where we are, and it's going to be really difficult for anybody of his stature to be able to advance quickly enough to stay with where the game is going. And I see that that's, in my opinion, that's what's happening. And that's why I don't think and haven't thought for a couple of years now that Thibs is going to be the right coach for the Knicks to take them to the championship ceiling. I think he has been the right coach to take them to kind of develop and build a foundation, but I don't think he's the one to get them over the hump. This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host XJ. As always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host Geoff. Geoff, we have a lot to talk about these New York Knicks. There is a lot going on. The Knicks have just come off a big loss to the Boston Celtics. Showed some fight in the second half there, but it was not looking pretty early. And there is a lot to dissect, a lot to talk about. We were both active on social media, commenting live about the game, getting tons of feedback. Lots of people seem to be coalescing around a few perspectives, but I think we can dive in a lot deeper. And I think we have kind of more to explore and dissect in a longer form. So at times like these, I'm so thankful that we have Hot Hand Theory to break down our insights in a lot of depth here. So Geoff, I don't know, like this is why I always rely on you to kind of dictate where we start, because there's so many places we could start from. Where should we dive into talking about that game, the Knicks in general, and the Knicks moving forward?
That's tough. You rely on me, and I'm not going to say I have no answers. I do think that I have a lot of answers to the stuff that we're going to try and dive into, but there are so many interesting angles to look at it from. On one hand, this is just, more par for the course for the Knicks. They're 0-7 on the season now against the top three teams in the league. And, some people might just say the Knicks aren't good enough. They're just not at that level and they never can be. I know people who listen to our show, I don't want to say religiously, but are here, week in, week out to hear our Knicks analysis. No, we don't think that's true. Actually, do you still think that that's not true, or has your overall opinion about the ceiling of this team changed at all throughout this season? Like, should we, after these 3 games against the Celtics, these couple of games against the Thunder and Cavs, should we just alter our outlook about what this team can be? Because I have a pretty strong feeling about that, but I'd love to hear your take on that first.
I wouldn't be ready to change my position on that. No. And the reason being, we have yet to see all of the potential ways that the Knicks could show that they can compete with these teams. We have yet to see the Knicks be, in my opinion, I know in your opinion and many fans and pundits, analysts' opinion, the Knicks have yet to be optimized in a way that we can see how they can actually go toe to toe with some of these great teams. And until that point, I would not be ready to say a team that consists of, one of the best point guards, if not the best point guard in the East, one of the best centers, if not the best center in the East, 2 elite wing 3-and-D players, and also an elite 3-and-D player, in my opinion, in terms of Deuce McBride coming off the bench, one of the best transition, finishing, rebounding, playing bigger than his size wings in the league, and Josh Hart. Great 3-point shooting off the bench from all different angles, like versatile, switchable wing/bigs off the bench. Like, obviously we haven't seen Mitchell Robinson come back, but these are all things that indicate to me, just on paper and theoretically, that they should absolutely be able to compete with these elite teams in the league. And because we haven't seen what I think could be an optimized deployment of this team from a lineup perspective, from a schematic perspective, from a strategic perspective, I'm definitely not ready to say that they are just out of their depths with going against some of these teams and they're just don't have enough talent. I don't believe that. And if we saw some of that stuff and we still saw these same results, then I'd start to be able to kind of move in that direction. But unfortunately, we're not seeing much experimentation. We're not seeing much by way of different deployments, different strategic, deployments. So no, I'm definitely not ready to say that at this point.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And it was really jarring in this game. Well, it's honestly been jarring every game the Celtics and the Knicks have played because maybe this sounds insane to some people, but I actually think the overall talent between the two teams is much closer than has been reflected on the court. You want to say that the Celtics have an advantage? I'm not going to argue with you. I think Jason Tatum's the best player in the game. I know Jason Tatum's the best player in the game. I think that White, Porzingis, Jaylen Brown, Al Horford, Drew Holiday, their top six is in any conversation of top sixes. I don't know about historically, but they're a really really high quality top six. Guess what? The Knicks have a really really good top six too, and I really really want our listeners to think about the get out of the lens of looking through what's actually happening on the court and try to put yourself in the perspective of what could be happening if these players were being optimally used and were being put in better positions to succeed. We know what that would look like for the Celtics because they are being put in the best positions to succeed. Every single player is their best version of themselves, right down to look beyond their top six. You've got Peyton Pritchard, who is one of the front runners for Sixth Man of the Year. His elite shooting is being emphasized, sure, but he's not killing them on defense. He's in the right places. Their principles are sound. Sam Hauser, another guy, elite shooter, not killing them on defense. Luke Cornett, absolute beast defensively. Ninth man who's helping them defensively, smart offensively as a screen setter and a finisher. This is a guy who was unplayable on bad Knicks teams 5 years ago. So it's totally jarring, not from a talent perspective, but from a deployment perspective. It's very interesting to me to think about what the conversations would be if you simply flip the head coaches for each team. What would, the people who are proponents of Tom Thibodeau say about guys like Peyton Pritchard and Sam Hauser, who, in my opinion, would probably become close to unplayable? What would they say about a Derek White, who, in my opinion, would probably go from fringe all-star starter to energy sixth man guy so they could get some more size in the starting lineup? What would the conversations we'd be having about this Celtics team if you just switch the head coaches and we didn't get all this development strategically and from a principle standpoint in terms of these players? I don't know, but I think the conversations about the two teams would be a lot different. And that just goes to show, at least it shows me, what is possible for this Knicks team. What meat is left on the bone in terms of unrealized potential. And look, we try to get on here from the perspective of not Knicks fans, of just analysts. That's our goal. But I'm gonna, put on my Knicks fan cap here for 2 seconds and say I hope that is not what this season gets remembered as. There's still 25 plus games in this season. Still plenty of time for the players and the team itself to realize its potential. But I just don't want to look back at the season and have some people think, oh, this is a personnel issue. They need to add a couple pieces. Yes, this is not a perfect team. Yes, they could be helped by adding pieces. But I truly believe that from a top six perspective, this team does have enough. And when the playoffs get here and the rotations get shorter, a top six is enough. Like, yes, you need guys like Payne and Precious Achua and even Mitchell Robinson when he comes back to fill in and play certain roles. But I don't think they need more. I think they can win with this team. They just need to actualize some of this potential.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Pretty much across the board. Obviously, those who know how I think about the game, Joe Mazzulla is one of my favorite coaches in the NBA, and I think one of the best coaches in the NBA based on some of his more innovative strategies and tactical approaches to the game and the way that he looks at the game. And I think that that's really what's missing. And it doesn't have to be, Thibs doesn't have to be a Joe Mazzulla like that. Joe Mazzulla does some things that are probably would be considered extreme, and that many really great coaches, even currently, would probably say, we wouldn't go that far. But that being said, I just think that I don't know. Right now, he's nowhere near that level, and by he I mean Thibs. And what I would say about Thibs, I do think Thibs is an excellent coach. I want to be really clear about that. I think that people think that we hate Thibs, we talk about him too negatively, and all these things, and it's just not accurate. I think Thibs is an excellent coach. I think something that we said repeatedly, he raises the floor of his team consistently, and he has over the course of his career. He often maximizes his teams defensively and has at earlier points of his career. And that's often the place where coaches can have the greatest effect. So oftentimes a team's offensive effectiveness is dictated by their team construction and the lineups that they run out. Defense is something where schemes and simplification of roles and consistency and drills and principles, they all have a significant impact from a coaching perspective and a coaching standpoint, and can vary from coach to coach. And that's something that Thibs has really thrived on throughout his career. I think he's excellent, and has been excellent. I don't think the game is like passed him by or something extreme like that, but I do think that there are younger, more forward-thinking coaches who are advancing the game at a very fast pace. And if you're more entrenched in your ways, having been highly successful in those ways, rising up the ranks, securing contract after contract, developing strong relationships, seeing high levels of success on the court, if you've been very successful in the ways that you've done things in the past, it's going to be more difficult to go in and drastically change things and do things and go in a different direction if you didn't have that baggage, so to speak. And I say baggage for lack of a better term, but it's like positive baggage in a way, but positive baggage can hinder advancement as well. And it's almost a trap of success in a way. And as things continue to advance and things change in terms of offensive approaches, tactics, the value of different shots, you need to be able to keep up with that. And I don't think it's a Thibs thing. I think it's just difficult for any coach at any point to coach across 30 years and be able to adequately keep up with the changes and advancements that we're seeing from young, innovative, smart, thoughtful coaches that are coming into the league. And I just think it's extremely difficult. It's not a reflection on Thibs. It's not that I think he's like a bad person or he's not, a smart basketball person. I understand a ton of what Thibs supporters appreciate about him. Hard work, consistency, dedication, longevity, adherence to core values and core principles. All that stuff really matters. It matters in the game and it matters for life. And so I totally understand the appreciation of Thibs from that standpoint. At the same time, we're talking about practical on-court stuff. In my opinion, there are smarter, younger, better coaches who have maybe learned from a lot of what he's done in the past, and he's been able to kind of help them build to where they are now. But now this is where we are, and it's going to be really difficult for anybody of his stature to be able to advance quickly enough to stay with where the game is going. And I see that that's, in my opinion, that's what's happening. And that's why I think, I don't think and haven't thought for a couple of years now that Thibs is going to be the right coach for the Knicks to take them to the championship ceiling. I think he has been the right coach to take them to kind of develop and build a foundation, but I don't think he's the one to get them over the hump.
Yeah, it's interesting because we could be looking at a lesser version, but a similar version of what maybe the Warriors could have looked like if they never moved on from Mark Jackson to Steve Kerr. Like, would they have just naturally figured out a way to evolve with the game? Would they have pushed the game forward in terms of their ball movement and their off ball movement and their passing and the huge influx of threes that they started taking, leveraging Steph Curry's amazing gravity? Or would they have just stayed sort of where they were in terms of just being in the middle of the West and running a lot of pick and rolls, running a lot of ISOs, mid-post ISOs, things that we definitely don't know the Warriors for now? And I thought that was just beautifully said by you. And it, honestly, it made me appreciate like just having a co-host who can just remember that some of the things that are in my head aren't baked into every single one of our perspectives, because it's almost disrespectful to our audience to just assume that they know that, yes, we have this respect for the man. And It's not coming at it from a position of, oh my God, this guy's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's doing, et cetera, et cetera. It's, you know, these things, these marginal areas are going to matter more at the highest level. And it's just trying to figure out if the things that are clearly baked into Thibs' coaching at this point, I think it's almost apparent that we know what his biases are and what the things he's going to try and leverage, the things he's going to lean on when the things get toughest. Are those the things that give you the best chance of winning? And remember, it's about the best chance. The Knicks could still very well win a championship with Tom Thibodeau as their coach this year. The balls could roll their way. The threes could go in for them and not go in for their opponent. At the end of the day, and this is very important to remember in this conversation, a coach can only control so much. So when we're criticizing the coach, this isn't to say there aren't areas that they can never improve on. Karl-Anthony Towns is never going to magically become a good rim protector or good in drop coverage. That's 0% Tom Thibodeau's fault. That is everything to do with the player. And some of these lapses you see defensively against Boston are just head scratching. They have nothing to do with Thibs. It's just everything to do with the player. But there are things that you can lean on that put him in better positions to succeed defensively. There are principles you can value as a coach and as a team. You can understand that giving up baskets at the rims a little bit more maybe doesn't matter as much if you're giving up way fewer threes against a team like Boston. All of a sudden, Towns' defensive impact might improve if he wasn't so dead set on needing to be at the rim, needing to have a body at the rim. That is a possibility right there. And so these are all things we have to consider when we're having this conversation, because I respect the people who come in and say, oh yeah, it's Thibs' fault that X player did this, Y player did that. And it's like, no, those things aren't his fault, but there are things that he can control, and the things that maybe we're asking him to evolve to, those are doable. Karl-Anthony Towns becoming a better rim protector is just not feasible. Jalen Brunson becoming a couple inches taller and being a better defender is not feasible. These are things you can't fix. Precious Achiuwa becoming a better shooter, not fixable. But you know what you can fix? Not playing him at power forward against a team that's obviously going to exploit that. One of those things is fixable. One of them isn't. So this is like a coach an NFL coach who punts and then in the post game says, well, the punt would have worked if our defense got the stop. No, you can't. No, you have no control over whether your defense gets the stop. You have total control over your team's decision to punt. So this is all a part of the conversation, but by no means are we saying, oh, this is 100% Tom Thibodeau's fault. He's an idiot. And if you put another coach in, they would just be locked champions. So I just want to make that very clear.
Yeah, and I'm glad we spent some time on that, because I think that's really important. I think that there may be people who hear us, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on this show, who think that we are thinking that way. But so I think it's important that we spend some time kind of articulating that really clearly. And that being said, I do think that the Knicks' best chance to win a championship will, again, like I said, it will be with a different coach. I don't know who that coach is potentially, but I don't think it'll be with Thibs. And part of the reason is some of these kind of biases towards different stylistic preferences that Thibs has. And one way that we saw that on the court against the Boston Celtics was with some minutes there with Josh Hart and Precious Achiuwa playing together. I think, to me, it was just really staggering after seeing the way that the Celtics were so heavily exploiting Josh Hart, in particular when he was on the court by himself. And Thibs' recourse to that was to add Precious Achiuwa to that mix and give the Celtics an even better ability to leverage the lack of shooting that the Knicks were playing on the court. There's a particular play, Geoff, that you and I both, we were both texting each other about instantly after it happened. We were both watching the game. I watched that possession. I, laughed in a very dark comedy sort of way after watching it. I look at my phone to text you about it, and you had texted me and said, "Oh my God, did you just see what just happened?" And we had the same exact thinking, and it was so jarring, this play. And this was a play when Josh Hart and Precious Achiuwa were both on the court together. Going to bring it up on the screen to kind of show our audience as we kind of talk about it. So this possession starts where the Celtics are cross-matched. So they kind of are cross-matched in transition or semi-transition, you might say. Horford's over on Brunson. But, it's okay for the Celtics because Brown can leave Josh Hart to come switch since Josh Hart is not a threat above the break from that position to shoot from three. Not only that, but Tatum, he doesn't immediately need to retreat to Hart because Porzingis can guard both Precious and Hart long enough for help to come if needed. So there's a lot of things already happening at the very beginning of this possession where the Knicks maybe should have an early advantage in the possession. And from the Celtics standpoint, Joe Mazzulla loves an early advantage. If he can get in transition and have an advantage, he's going to take advantage of that immediately and try to put the Celtics in a scoring position. If not, they'll definitely reset. But the Knicks should be in that position, but are not as a result of this spacing dilemma. So you'll also notice Porzingis never needs to leave the paint effectively the entire possession. He's able to kind of toe tap outside of the paint to keep his 3 seconds alive, but he never needs to leave the paint. And I think this is really interesting from the perspective, Geoff, of we know Joe Mazzulla loves to incorporate these lessons from other sports and games. He watches a lot of soccer. He incorporates soccer principles and such. On this possession, Porzingis positioning is almost like a chess principle. And I love chess. It's something I play every day. In chess, you want to control the center with like your pawns or your pieces. And the reason you do that, it's not arbitrary. It's because being in the center gives you the best scope and ability to get to any side of the board easily when those pieces are in the center. And here, Porzingis is not only able to easily retreat to guard the rim, which is the primary goal, to have your rim protector near the rim, but he can also potentially help out on the perimeter if there's a breakdown somewhere, and he can help take away open threes. In my opinion, that leaves the Knicks with this in this situation, their best option that they will get, their optimal shot that they can get on this possession is effectively an open three from a really bad shooter or a mid-range shot. That is like the optimal that they can hope for. And if that's what you're going for, if that's the best you can hope for, you're in a terrible position. It's just like the worst case scenario effectively. So going back to it, Precious is up top. There's no hard cutting. There's no hard screening off the ball. Brunson has a soft cut baseline. It doesn't matter because Tatum can guard Hart and Brunson at the same time because Hart's not a threat out there. Tatum is able to, as the ball moves to the other side, Tatum is able to float under the dribble handoff between Precious and Hart. Geoff, a DHO with two non-shooters is crazy. Like, what do we do? How are we doing a DHO with two non-shooters? Both defenders just mirror their matchups and go under the screen, and it's like nothing happened. Then Towns is trying to get post position, but he can get just doubled because it's easy. Hart cuts through after the entry, which this is something I think is really key. Watch Al Horford's eyes. This is something that really stood out to me when we were texting about this and we were watching this live. Horford never needs to confirm that Josh Hart is walking into a Celtics defender. Normally, you would imagine, okay, I'm sending my guy. He's cutting to the middle. I need to make sure he's going to a defender. He could be cutting into open space. He never needs to check because he knows because Precious is on the court on that side, the weak side defender can obviously pick up Hart. He doesn't even need to look. He doesn't even need to divert his attention even for a second. These micro differences in decision making, in all of these, having the players need to think a second more, these matter. These add up to increasing your potential odds of creating a good shot on offense. When you overload a side, the defense can often have one defender guard two, but when you overload a side with two non-shooters, it becomes so much easier to the point where Horford can literally comfortably double on the strong side without even needing to look at his defender cutting into space. Then at the end of it, Towns makes a great pass for the best shot the Knicks can get, a wide open Precious corner three that, surprise, winds up in an air ball.
That pass by Towns, by the way, is insane.
That was a Luka Doncic pass from Towns.
Unbelievable pass. He's I can't believe how right you were about him as a passer. Why do I question you?
I'm definitely not always right, but I mean, Towns is a great passer.
He really is. I just want to say that this possession, I'm so glad you used the word. It's so emblematic. You use the word microtransactions. And it's so hard it's really hard for me, and I'm aware of this phenomenon. It's so hard for any basketball fan to understand or properly value these little microtransactions. But these are things that happen every possession. Do they happen to this extreme an extent? No. This was crazy. This is just like a poster of it so we can try to highlight for you how what this phenomenon is like. But every possession that you're not actively involved in the primary action, if you're not the ball handler or the screen setter or on the short roll, you are still contributing to your team's likelihood of scoring. All 5 guys. This isn't the 80s or the 90s when it was illegal to pre-rotate and you just dump it into Michael Jordan and the other guys didn't even really matter because Michael Jordan could go to work one-on-one and it was just like, good luck. Like that's your best chance. Defenses are able to be wherever they want, basically. Illegal defense, as long as you're not in the paint for 3 seconds, defenders can play zone, they can stand wherever they want, and if you're not decentivizing them from ignoring you, they're going to ignore you. And so this is why you look at the box score and you see that, and I don't want to dump on him because he's been great this season, but you see, Josh Hart's 8 of 14 and Jalen Brunson's whatever he was, Towns' whatever they were. You can't just look at that. Towns is 9 of 20, Brunson's 9 of 19. You can't just look at their field goal percentage, their actual output, because some of these guys are benefactors of other people's gravity and other people's advantage creation, and other people are benefiting from it, or excuse me, are benefiting from it. So Some people are creating it, and some people are having it created for them. And so, look, I think at this point, and by the way, we've seen enough lineup data that the starting lineup with Deuce in for Bridges instead of Hart, that could be an answer too. So, but the point of all this is to say these microtransactions across 50 possessions, 100 possessions, a season, they add up because maybe, it's only 0.01% in a possession. But I promise you, if you're making a difference in your team's ability and your teammates' ability to put the ball in effectively, it's going to matter in the long run. And that's what we're seeing here. We see it in the data, and this is why XJ have been on this all season long, because we felt very confident that across the totality of a season, if you have more shooting on the court, as long as you're not just punting everything else, you're giving guys like Brunson, guys like Towns, the best opportunity to score effectively.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And speaking of these sort of microtransactions, I think the hardest thing, and we talk about the eye test and the limitations of the eye test oftentimes, and this is exactly what we're getting at. I think a lot of people, and you mentioned to me right before we jumped on the pod, people talk about kind of like, things that are happening that are impacting the game outside of the box score. And you mentioned how oftentimes people mean, hustle plays and diving on the floor and making an extra pass and things like that. And those things really matter a ton. But even those things are sort of not invisible to the eye. Those are things you can see watching the game. You can kind of see, oh, this guy dove on the floor. Maybe the Knicks don't get that loose ball if he's on the court. And that really matters. But these are microtransactions, are things that are really hard to pick up. It's almost impossible, I would say, impossible to know the actual impact of those. To first of all, to add them up, to say the Knicks had, 100 of them and the Celtics had 70 of them. And then to also say what the actual impact of those things are. It's almost imperceptible to the eye. And so you can't calculate that, what the impact of that is. And that's something we use metrics for. That's something the metrics are attempt to do. There are some limitations to the metrics even that we recognize. And so we have to kind of use all of this information together to kind of decide what the best options are. And oftentimes to me, lineup data is sort of the best way to do it, to go about doing it, unless you're making fundamental changes in terms of schematic changes, approach changes, tactical changes that you're implementing considerably or significantly to those lineup configurations. What we see from the lineups when it gets to a certain possession count is sort of what we need to start to expect. And so what you need to do is play the lineups that seem most promising, that are most effective, and see how those perform as they get to really higher and higher sample size levels. When we're talking about lineup data, there's only one player you can go to for the Knicks. And, it's funny that we're like halfway into the pod and we just start mentioning this player. Deuce McBride. Deuce McBride, you tweeted about it. Every time Deuce McBride is in the game, good things happen. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that's just by chance. I don't think that's just by luck. Deuce McBride is the only Knick, and we've talked about this before. This is a data point that I brought up a number of times. Still true. Deuce McBride is the only Knick in every single one of their 6 best lineups with over 100 possessions. The Knicks have 6 really high-end players on their team, like you mentioned, some bench players that, could be hit or miss, but 6 really high-level NBA players. Deuce McBride is the only one of them that is on every single one of their 6 best lineups. The worst of those 6 best lineups is plus 15.6 per 100 possessions, better than their opponents. Take it a step further, we're just looking at Deuce McBride. When McBride and OG Anunoby are on the court, just those two, the Knicks are plus 16 points per 100 possessions better than opponents, which is 98th percentile among all 2-man pairings. This is over a sample size of 1,037 possessions, 98th percentile. Now, when you have this kind of lineup data, in my opinion, we see what the starting lineup does. I talked about this in the last episode. We've seen all different kind of configurations. We see potentially Josh Hart may have a positive or negative impact depending on who he's playing with. Precious Achiuwa generally has not had a positive impact almost regardless of who he's playing with. You got to play Deuce McBride, OG Anunoby together. You got to play Deuce McBride with all these combinations. Deuce McBride has to be a guy who plays 30 minutes per game for you. I really don't see a way around it. What are your thoughts here on the way that Deuce is being used, his impact, how he's making such a strong impact despite, maybe having a quote unquote down shooting season? He shot 41% from 3 last year. He's shooting 37% from 3 this year, although he's shooting close to 50% on wide open 3-pointers. And having a career year with regard to his impact in terms of his overall EPM, estimated plus minus, and just, I think, doing stuff even outside of what EPM is able to capture or what the box score is clearly able to capture. So, yeah, what are your just thoughts on Deuce McBride and that whole situation of what we're seeing as we've been talking about, needing more minutes, still only at around 24 minutes per game across the 47 games that he's played this season?
Isn't that wild, though? Like that, is there anything more reflective of the value of this passive impact and these little microtransactions that we're talking about, that Deuce McBride's overall impact per EPM has increased to a career high despite his shooting going down? I mean, he was just 1 for 7 against the Celtics, and I think you could argue that he was one of the most impactful Knicks in that game. He was excellent defensively. His defense was insane, absolutely wild. He at times seemed like the only one who understood that you have to guard multiple players sometimes against the Celtics team, the way they move the ball, and he was there every single time. But more importantly, on the other side of the ball where the Knicks struggle, and this is related to that thread I made the other day from Hot Hand Theory, where, I talked about how the vision for this team, the optimal vision for this team, is prioritizing offense and accepting that that's going to come with, a league average, maybe slightly above league average defense. That's the vision for this team. And so this Knicks Celtics game was emblematic of that, because they, their defense, they may have ran a little good with shot quality and allowing open looks, but they allowed a manageable and acceptable amount of points. If you give up 110 non-garbage time points to the Celtics, you can win that game. You can be in that game. But when the starters they didn't step off the court, but when I thought the starters were going to step off the court, they had like 93 points. They had 93 points. And you can't beat the Celtics that way. You can't beat the Celtics scoring 93 points. And frankly, when we talk about benefitters and benefactors, Deuce McBride, as much as people may not get it, Deuce McBride is a benefactor. He is someone who, when Jalen Brunson plays with Deuce McBride, Jalen Brunson's life is easier. Deuce McBride is not going to get these layups on back cuts because nobody's paying attention to him. He's not going to set a screen and then get the ball on the short roll and maybe have a path to the basket, because the principle of the smart defense is he's the guy you're helping off of. Deuce McBride's defender is always tied to him, and that creates a domino effect that helps guys like Karl-Anthony Towns and Jalen Brunson. And so there's a reason why on the season, Jalen Brunson is shooting 9% higher from 3 when Deuce McBride plays with them. There's a reason that Jalen Brunson is shooting 9% higher at the rim when Deuce McBride plays with him, because he's a benefactor, not a benefitter. That is what Deuce McBride does for you. That's why he needs to be on the court more. And if you want to say, oh, well, if Deuce McBride needs to play for your team, then your team's not a contender anyway. Okay, if that's your perspective, great. But how is that an argument against trying to optimize your team? What does that even mean? Like, sure, maybe the Knicks have bigger problems and they need to make a different trade for a better star who can play better defense. Maybe this team doesn't have a championship ceiling. That's not an argument against that's not an argument for playing a suboptimal version of your team. That's, to be frank, that's idiotic. That doesn't senseless. It doesn't make any sense at all. Deuce McBride is in all your best lineups. Just play him more. There's no argument against it.
Yeah, it's really well put. I think to really drill down on this, sort of we've come up with this sort of framework where there are beneficiaries and benefactors, and this is not a binary. This is not black or white. But every player is a little bit of both, ideally, in the vast majority of situations. But beneficiaries are those who benefit from others, very obviously, and benefactors are those who help benefit others. So when Deuce McBride is on the court with Jalen Brunson's life is easier. When Josh Hart is on the court with Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart's life is easier. And that's really what we're talking about. That's really what it comes down to in this case. I think that is why Deuce McBride has this kind of lineup data. That is, to me, that is the reason. And I think that is incredibly important when you have a player like Deuce McBride, who is not just shooting 37% from three. It's not just about his percentages. It's about his willingness to shoot. Over the last 2 years, he shot 7.7 threes per 75 last year and shooting 7.1 threes per 75 this year. That is incredible volume. That is really important. And obviously it's not like he doesn't have the highest volume on the team. The highest volume on the team is Campaign, who has never seen an open shot or even a covered shot that he doesn't like. But Campaign doesn't come with all the same advantages that Deuce McBride comes with in terms of his defensive aggression and his ability to guard on the ball, his ability to maneuver around screens and all the things that he does. So, in my opinion, that is really what it comes down to in a lot of cases. His willingness to shoot, the gravity that commands, his defense on the ball. Those are the things that the Knicks need the most in these lineups with Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns. They need that more than they need potentially, secondary or tertiary rebounding, more than they need, transition creation outlets potentially from that you can get from a guy like Josh Hart. Those things are extremely important. And those things would be even more important when Jalen Brunson's off the court, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I just think that's what you need more of, and that's what Deuce McBride offers, and that's the reason why we see this lineup data. I don't think it's a coincidence.
Yeah, I don't even know why I had to interject there, because it was just such a good point. Josh Hart's transition, him creating offense that way, would easily be the most valuable with Jalen Brunson's not on the court. It's more acceptable to run a half-court offense a higher percentage of the time if Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns are on the court together. Your half-court offense is going to be really good, especially if they have maximized space. When Campaign is running the offense and you have Precious Achiuwa with him and Landry Shamet, who's a good shooter, as we saw in this game, but a little streaky and can't really create much of his own basket, that's where you want Josh Hart grabbing the rebound and going, because you want to be in the half court less. When you're in the half court, you're going to be less effective. These are things that all add up. And I had a thought during this game, and it's sort of related to this passive impact and the stuff we're talking about with Deuce McBride. I'm watching the Celtics, XJ, and this is, an amazing team. And I flash back to something you said just very innocently early in the season, and it just sort of stuck with me. The Celtics are this amazing team who their starting lineup is almost perfectly synergistic. It is 5 guys who, in any other situation where maybe their team is a little worse, could probably be all-stars. We've seen Drew Holiday be an all-star in the past. Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum are multi-time all-stars. We've seen Kristaps Porzingis be an all-star in the past. Derek White should have been an all-star the last 2 seasons. This is 5 very good, high-quality all-star players. But ignore the vacuum, ignore how good they are. One of them is the worst at every aspect of the game, right? So you have the worst defender. Even if he's still a good defender, you want to attack the worst defender, right? Like that should be the goal. Even if he's a good defender, you have to pick and choose. You have to pick your battles. You have to take the lesser of five evils. Well, when you are trying to figure out where your help should come from, you have to help off somebody, even if the five guys are very good. You have to pick the lessest of five very good options. And what I'm wondering, XJ, is if you're the Knicks or another team that clearly understands this exploitative strategy and is watching it unfold in front of your eyes with the way the Celtics defend Precious Achiuwa and Josh Hart, why do they not choose Jaylen Brown as that guy? What is the difference? Why do teams not look at Jaylen Brown and think, all right, you haven't shot the ball well this season. Yes, you're a good shooter, but you're probably the worst shooter on this team. I think that your offense will be worse if Jaylen Brown is unfortunately shooting some open above the break threes. Why don't two teams that? What am I missing here? That they're just willing to, they're trying to play the Celtics straight up and walking and letting guys like Tatum, Porzingis, and White walk into open threes, which in my opinion is a much worse option. What is the discrepancy here?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, earlier in the season, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, being someone who watches every Knicks game really closely, being someone who's watched a ton of Oklahoma City Thunder games, especially last year with Josh Giddey on the court and the way that Josh Giddey was defended at times in a similar way to the way that Josh Hart is defended. I've come to call it sort of like a ghost coverage. So basically when they play a big on a wing, typically, and the reason they're able to get away with that to keep the big close to the paint is because the wing is not a threatening shooter. And so that kind of kills two birds with one stone potentially. And so the Knicks get this ghost coverage played against them by the elite teams in the league, the Cavaliers, the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Boston Celtics, the teams who have, or who are the elite teams and also have the best coaches, in my opinion. And so why don't we see that same thing with Jaylen Brown? Well, first of all, I want to say that my thought, especially early in the season, was that we will see that in the playoffs. I think we'll see smart coaches and smart teams start to cover Jaylen Brown in this way and sort of give him this ghost coverage treatment and with Porzingis being someone who is a really strong post player and can score out of the post. But is someone who's not particularly physically strong and could potentially be guarded by a smaller player in the same way that we see bigger wings guard Victor Wembanyama in many cases. So I think that is kind of fitting for us to see this, exactly what you're talking about. Jaylen Brown get this sort of ghost coverage in the playoffs, but I don't think they can see a steady diet of it the same way the Knicks see it on every single possession that Josh Hart is on the court, or that Josh Hart and Precious is on the court, or that Precious is on the court instead of Josh Hart. They'll see that every single possession, and a couple reasons, but I think the main reason is that when Thibs is coaching, we see just a ton of stagnation in these situations where Josh Hart is not as involved in the action. You mentioned it earlier, when this comes out, it will have been yesterday. You mentioned how Josh Hart needs to be involved in the action effectively every time, whether it's he's conducting a pick and roll and he's the one with the ball, whether he's involved in the pick and roll in the screening capacity, whether there's some kind of off-ball cutting action that's directly involved in the play to occupy the guy who's supposed to be defending him, who is not really defending him. He has to be involved in the play almost every time. And I think when you go up against the Celtics, Joe Mazzulla is aware of this potential possibility because he has gotten the Celtics to play this way, like perfectly. Like there's no team that's going to play this kind of ghost coverage better than the Celtics. They have super smart defenders and guys like Al Horford, and guys like who are some of their other defenders who we just talked about, Luke Cornett, who's really good at it. And then Porzingis has gotten better. I don't think it's his best trait, but he's gotten better since he's done it so much. You are going to have Jaylen Brown be in the action a ton, and trust me, Joe Mazzulla is fine with doing that. Joe Mazzulla is fine with saying we don't have an advantage. They're shading from one side of the court. They're really gearing up to protect the rim. They're leaving our guy open. Let's run the offense through Jaylen Brown. All right. Well, then Jaylen Brown will get the ball and we'll find a mismatch for Jaylen Brown and he'll attack that mismatch, or he'll run pick and roll for himself. Whatever he needs to do, he will be involved in the action. And Joe Mazzulla is totally comfortable with having Jaylen Brown involved in every single action. it's not the same when you're talking about Thibs. Thibs is trying to run an offense that's run through Jalen Brunson with Josh Hart off the ball somewhere. And he is sort of trying to smash a square peg in a round hole. And it just is ineffective. And so, in my opinion, you will see that in the playoffs from the really smart coaches who will try to exploit Jaylen Brown in that way. But also, because Missoula is so prepared for that style and has almost coined that style and really perfected it, he will have counters. And the Knicks just don't seem to have very many counters that they deploy on a consistent basis. And to me, that's the difference in why this ghost coverage is so effective versus the Knicks and not really deployed as much against the Celtics.
Man, that's just an awesome answer. And it brings me to the Cavs because, the Cavs start essentially two non-shooters. I know Mobley's shooting has improved this season, but he's not shooting contested threes. He's not shooting pull-up threes. He's basically just walking into open threes and making them at a higher rate, which, to be frank, has value. If he's the center and he's you can call a team that Evan Mobley's on. If he's the only non-shooter, you can effectively call that 5 out or 4.5 out with how much he's creating offense from the perimeter. But people, will say, well, how do the Cavs make it work? They've got two non-shooters. Well, Mobley's in the action all the time now. That's one of arguably the number one change Cleveland has made from going from J.B. Bickerstaff to Kenny Atkinson is Atkinson has enabled Mobley as a ball handler and a possession starter in a way that Bickerstaff never did. And Mobley's benefited from it tremendously. And the reason this is so important, the reason we need to see Josh Hart do it, or Knicks fans need to see Josh Hart do it more in these matchups against the Celtics, is because you can't pre-rotate off of someone when they have the ball in their hands. Guys like Josh Hart and Evan Mobley are too skilled. They'll just get to the basket every single time. This is why they should be screen setters. They should be starting the action. You want to see Josh Hart have the ball at the top of the key with Brunson and Towns in a horn set or something. These are all potential options for non-shooters to have. You also just need Josh Hart to shoot a little bit more because he has shown stretches where he is a good shooter. He can force adjustments that way too. Teams are human. These aren't robots. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. They will adjust if Josh Hart forces them to. And that I'm talking, hitting a couple threes over a short over a short stretch. But I digress. Bring it back to Cleveland. This is a team that's making two non-shooters work, and they're doing it through some of these principles that XJ is talking about. Having Mobley be involved in the action, using a lot of off-ball movement, a lot of off-ball screening. This is arguably the team that moves off the ball more than any other team in the league. And again, this is just stuff the Knicks don't do.
The Cleveland Cavaliers are, and I want to give you credit, Geoff, because you've been talking about the Cavs all season, since very early in the season, before they were taking off and winning every single game. You were saying, watch Cleveland. I was like, I don't know. They're hot. I'm looking at the data. The data suggests they're all shooting above their heads. None of this seems really sustainable. They're in terms of their just ability to make shots that they really shouldn't. They probably are the best shot making team in the league. I know statistically they are. The Knicks were up there for a little while. They've fallen off a little bit. And so I was just holding out a little bit, holding out. And watching more Cleveland, and as some of their kind of incredible shot making has dipped, they've still maintained a lot of the efficiency and effectiveness they started off the season with. And that is, in my opinion, because Kenny Atkinson is incredible at what he's doing over there. Like you mentioned, one of these non-shooters, quote unquote non-shooters, you also mentioned this, Evan Mobley is shooting, 3.5 threes per 75 and shooting like 38% from three. I wouldn't necessarily call him a non-shooter. I think he's a better shooter than Josh Hart, which is kind of crazy to say. But I'll for the purposes of this conversation, I'll call him a non-shooter. One of the non-shooters is always in the action for Cleveland. There's no actions where it's just like Donovan going one-on-one unless one of the bigs is off the court. If both bigs are on the court, one of them's in the action. The other is always involved in some kind of off-ball action, cutting into space, relocating, off-ball screening. There's constant movement. The relocation and replacing players that have vacated space is such an incredible and important advancement in the NBA that we've seen this season from many teams. Teams do it in different ways. The Grizzlies do it without screens. The Cavaliers do it with screens. We'll see, and everything is sort of timed. There's a ton of cohesion. So as you see kind of a screen and roll with let's say Mobley screening on the ball and then diving towards the basket, he gets the ball early from one of the guards, and then you immediately have Jarrett Allen cutting on the other side. That's where you get all this big-to-big passing. Mobley's an incredible passer. Allen is also a very good passer. There's so much that they're doing that just disallows this double big situation to really kill their spacing to the extent that we're seeing it in situations with the Knicks. The Knicks they're just not doing any of this stuff, and it's the Knicks I won't say the Knicks don't do anything creative or aren't interesting offensively. I think they do a bunch of things, and I'm not trying to undermine, Thibs and the coaching staffs in that way tactically, but it is not on the level of some of these teams like Cleveland, like some of these teams like Boston. And until it is, you're not going to be able to survive with this kind of non-spacing configuration. And it's going to hurt you. And you're going to be susceptible to things like the ghost coverage at any given time.
And I just want to add, so we can close the loop on this, even though I do think that Atkinson will have answers that maybe Thibs wouldn't if he were to play a Boston team, if and when the Cavs play Boston in the Eastern Conference Finals, I don't think that Mobley and Allen will be a viable lineup combination. I think the Celtics will just absolutely dismantle it.
Yeah. And
and
Atkinson will just go to one big, and he'll just go to one big.
Yeah, he'll adjust. I agree with that. I'm just saying that in terms of the part of the conversation with, well, Cleveland's making it work, I don't think that Cleveland's going to make it work or sustain this level of success sustain this level of offensive success in a playoff series against Boston. I think they'll be forced to adjust. That is my projection. And High End Theory listeners, feel free to, in a couple months, if Cleveland wins a playoff series against Boston on the back of the double big lineup, feel free to bring this back up and laugh at me for being wrong. I don't see that happening. I can see Cleveland winning a playoff series against Boston. They're super well coached. They're super talented. I just think it's going to come with them realizing that essentially Mobley and Allen are unplayable together against teams like Boston and OKC. And this kind of brings me, or again, something you said inspired me, as you tend to do, to what maybe is going to be our last talking point of the day. But it's another thing that I think a lot of people are talking about, and I just love to hear your thoughts on it. I genuinely don't really know your thoughts. A lot of people are talking about how the Knicks are struggling because of a lack of advantage creation, and how Mikal Bridges hasn't lived up to the billing as the third advantage creator. And if the Knicks want to get on the level of a team like OKC or Boston or even Cleveland, they need another guy outside of Brunson and Towns who can draw a second defender and force the defense to be in rotation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is this honestly might end up spilling over to a different pod, honestly, because I think this is like a pod in of itself. But I'll say some initial thoughts on that. I don't think that's the key that's missing here. I don't, just in a macro, my overarching position is not. I don't think that's the key that's missing here. And I think that the Knicks have sort of, it's interesting because the Knicks have been in this situation where they have guys who are able to kind of create in a vacuum on their own in isolation. And that has not been the answer. To have Jalen Brunson, RJ Barrett, and Julius Randle all on the court at the same time is not a good solution, because what you kind of make up for, let's say you are able to create in isolation, teams are switching against you, one-on-one, these guys are able to score at a relatively high rate, you're actually causing other issues, right? So the spacing may not be as good for those guys to create in isolation. That's a problem in of itself. Unless you're unless you're saying the Knicks need an elite isolation scorer who's also an elite catch and shoot 3-point shooter, then I'd agree. I'd say, yeah, that'd be pretty dope. Yeah, that would probably change things. That would probably change things. But if you're talking about, like, man, if the Knicks only had like a Julius Randle instead of Karl-Anthony Towns, that would really solve their issues. I think you're opening up a whole other can of worms. And this is something you and I have talked about a bunch. There's just trade-offs to everything, and we have to acknowledge all of the trade-offs. This is not we get our cake and eat it too. If we get an isolation scorer like that, or someone who can create out of these, creating quote-unquote advantages out of these situations and one-on-one off of switches, then the overall shooting ability of the team will drop. The ability to capitalize on spacing will drop, and all those things are not going to work as well. So in my opinion, I just don't think that's a solution. I think that's a solution to one problem and opens up other problems. And just my last thought on that as well, these teams that are really smart, they're totally fine with living with these players scoring in isolation. Like yep. For the most part, if you're not going to penalize them by or if the penalty is an open three from an elite shooter, they would take that option all day. They'll say, okay, go ahead and ISO with, whoever people are talking about, whether it's Julius Randle or other guys like that. I've heard people saying like they should bring in, bench scorers that are these guys who are just like microwave guys who come in and score a bunch of points. I mean, these teams are going to be fine with living with 0.8 points per isolation possession or 0.93 points per. Even Jaylen Brown, who I was talking about earlier, who the Celtics would kind of default to allowing him to create. Jaylen Brown scores 0.8 points per possession in isolation. That's not a good possession. It's a bad possession. Like maybe with a matchup advantage, it gets a little higher. With the right spacing, it gets a little higher. But now if you have Jaylen Brown being your go-to guy and he's attacking every time down, you're not creating the best opportunity for the team. Other guys are getting stagnant. It's just not an ideal way to play. And so in my opinion, it really wouldn't change the fortunes of the Knicks. And that's kind of, I tried to be really quick and give an abridged version, but I think we need to really unpack that in a deeper way on a future pod.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing I'll add while we are talking about it now is the Bulls are second in 3-point attempts, and their offense is elite. They shoot a really good number from three. If you're a Knicks fan out there who thinks that the Knicks need more advantage creation, and you also think that the Bulls have more advantage creation than the Knicks, I don't think you're being intellectually honest. I don't think you actually believe that, and I think that alone should just make it clear that the ability to create threes and create good shots and good offense goes beyond advantage creation.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I totally agree. I think that's pretty much it. That's all the time we have to kind of talk about. I think it's a really important conversation. I think we should dive deeper and give it its due worth on the next pod. But any last thoughts, Geoff, before we close out here?
No, just well heard by me. Blah 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 blah. I got nothing. I'm totally spent from that episode. That game, that was high quality basketball game to watch, and appreciate everyone who took the time to watch our content per usual. And honestly, you know what? I actually do have a final thought. We were talking about this before we hopped on XJ. I don't know how much positive reinforcement and just positive comments you and I have gotten over the last couple of weeks or whatever. I mean, y'all have always been so kind to us in general, like in our comments here, but people reaching out to us and asking us if we'll go live after certain games and talking about how much they like our content and never thought about things that way. I mean, it's just as if we already didn't love coming on here enough just to talk to one another. It's just so motivating and so reinforcing. Not that we're like always right, but just people want to hear what we have to say and people want to engage with us. That's just so cool. So truthfully, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great closing statement. Yeah, it's been really awesome. We definitely just feel, humbling to get those comments and really appreciate all the support that we've gotten. And we're going to continue to build and grow as we go along, and we're definitely not stopping anytime soon. We have huge plans as we move forward, and we'll continue to expand and roll things out little by little. But if you're here like an hour into the pod and you're not subscribed, that's kind of crazy. So you should definitely subscribe if you're listening to this. But otherwise, we really appreciate all the support. And for Geoff, I'm XJ, and this has been Hot Hand Theory.